Why, thank you. I am Maurita Poole, and I am the Executive Director and Chief Curator of Newcomb Art Museum. So I just want to give you a little bit of insight about who we have on our panel today beyond their names, because we really are fortunate to have people who have a range of expertise, but also different cultural backgrounds that inform the ways in which they have come to the field of African art and how they will speak about our theme today, which is thinking about African art as a construct or ideas about Africa. So Amanda Maples, who's to my right, is the Francoise Billion Richardson Curator of African Art at the New Orleans Museum of Art. She has taught university courses in African arts and served in curatorial and scholarly capacities at the North Carolina Museum of Art, Stanford University's Cantor Art Center, the Yale University Art Gallery, the National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian Institution, the High Desert Museum, and UC Berkeley's Hearst Museum of Anthropology. Maples has served as the dialogues editor for the Journal of African Art since 2020 and is the vice president of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association, or ACASA, and has curated a range of exhibitions on historical and contemporary African art. Her scholarship explores urban and contemporary masquerade, decoloniality, jewelry and self-fashioning, museum policies, collecting practices, and restitutions. She holds a PhD in visual studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz. So please. And to her right is Erika Witt, who serves as a director and chief curator of Southern University at New Orleans Museum of Art and adjunct professor in museum studies. A resident of New Orleans, she is passionate about collections management and museum education, with a particular focus on the arts of Africa and the Africa diaspora, particularly with a specialization in Egyptology. She is currently completing her doctoral studies at Louisiana State University College of Art and Design, pursuing a Doctor of Design in Cultural Preservation with a focus on museum and archival studies, and her research centers on fostering the appreciation of traditional African art within cultural institutions across the city of New Orleans, as well as at historically Black colleges and universities nationwide. Please give her a round of applause. And last but not least is Tumelo Mosaka, who has generously agreed to come from New York to join us. Tumelo is a Johannesburg-born, New York City-based independent curator. He has worked within and outside museums exploring global transnational artistic practices, especially from Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. Currently, he serves as the project director for the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University and the resident curator, please excuse me if I mispronounce this, for the Opalaka Community Development Corporation in Miami. Previous positions include chief curator for Investec Cape Town Art Fair in South Africa. He served as the curator at the Cranard Art Museum in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, and before joining Cranard Art Museum, he was the associate curator of exhibitions at Brooklyn Museum in New York. So as I mentioned briefly, this session is thematically inspired by the exhibition, or I did not mention that. It is thematically inspired by an exhibition that we currently have on view at Newcomb Art Museum over in the Waldenberg Art Center that highlights South African art from 1948 until 2020. It is actually really exciting that we've been able to bring a selection from the Nando Arts Collection and the Spears Arts Trust, where we could have the opportunity to look at African art from one specific country rather than doing a juxtaposition of works from various countries on the continent of Africa. The Dallas-based curator who did the show for us is named Lori Ann Farrell, and she is really an advocate and someone who is very passionate about art from South Africa as well as throughout the continent. So with that in mind, I would like for us to begin just on a baseline level, since I'm not quite sure who's in the audience today, but I want us to really get a way of grounding how our panelists came to African art. And so my first question for you all is, could you talk about how you began to understand Africa as a construct, as a geography and its peoples during your childhood. Basically, or another way of saying that was, how did you begin to think about Africa? And you can all either jump in, or I can do the lovely in order, whatever your preference. So we'll start with Amanda.
Oh, okay. So I grew up in rural North Carolina and did not have access to a really strong education. I'm a first-generation college kid, so I did not learn much about Africa or African art, and yet was part of a really diverse community. And so when I finally got to university, learned about anthropology for the first time, and it's going to be an interesting part of our conversation, I think, about that sort of anthropological take on African art. But I actually did archaeology in South Africa in 2001, and that's how I came to start knowing more about the continent and how little this country teaches about such an important continent and its influence and its impact on American history, American culture, American politics, economics, everything. Africa is our present, our past, and our future, and I just was really struck by how little I knew until I got to college and then to South Africa and beyond. So
I look forward to you unpacking that lovely statement you just made about Africa is our past, our present, and our future. But we can come back to that. Sure. Erika, could you please talk about your introduction to the continent as well as the field of African art?
It all started 4 years ago. No, I'm kidding. No, what is it, 4 years ago is what they say? Sorry. When I get nervous, I make jokes, so don't mind me. I am originally from Roanoke, Virginia, very small town in Virginia. However, we are the biggest in our region. I had always been into Egyptology, and from a young age, even when my mother had this brass Ankh keychain that I clearly remember at the age of 2, I knew that I was drawn to it. And so really, until I even found out that Egyptology was a thing that you could get into, I had always steered myself towards Egyptology. However, in that region, there aren't many schools for Egyptology. And I remember I told my mom and my grandmother when I was in high school, like, yeah, I'm gonna go off to Egypt and I'm gonna go study at a university. And they were, Southern Black women, like, yeah, how are we going to get you if anything happens, right? And so shattered my dreams. It was cool, though. But I found a school in Tennessee called Tusculum College. Now it's Tusculum University. And they had one of the only bachelors of museum studies at the university. So if I couldn't study Egyptology the way that I wanted to, I figured I would pivot and then study Egyptology, but in a museum background. At the end of that, we had this internship before you graduate, and it forces you to go out into the community and work at a museum. And I chose to go back home to Virginia to an African American museum there, but it previously went defunct. Long story short, my internship experience was terrible, and they had this poster on the wall with all of these different African masks and the countries and the people groups, and I couldn't pronounce a single one, and I felt terrible because I figured I'm an African American, like I should know more than Egypt, right? I know about the continent, but I couldn't tell you anybody in West Africa. I couldn't tell you anyone in South Africa or Central Africa. So I swore to myself that I was going to go get get a master's degree in museum studies, and I was going to solely focus on African art. I had no idea. Maybe it was 2 weeks after I graduated and came to Southern University at New Orleans that they had the largest African art collection possibly in the city of New Orleans. And I've been there ever since, and I've loved it ever since. So I think it was spirit.
Mm. Tumelo, I know this may sound like an odd question, considering you are from Johannesburg and you grew up there, but could you please talk about your introduction, maybe not to Africa since you were born there, but to the field of African art?
No, yeah, it's true. But I will say that, being born in Africa, well, first of all, Africa is huge. It's a continent.
Yes.
So, even, people living in different parts of the continent have very little connection to their neighbors and again, I think you have to understand that the way Africa was constructed was a colonial project. And so even to this day, we still are suffering from those colonial legacies. Because for me, growing up in South Africa, just to go to Kenya is almost so difficult. It's easier to come to New York or to Paris rather than go to Zimbabwe or Malawi. So you have to understand that these borders that have been created are not only physical, but also mental. Because growing up in South Africa under apartheid, we always believed Africa was another place. Africa was this dark, underdeveloped place beyond the South African borders. And because apartheid was what it was, the only thing we knew about the rest of the continent was that that was where we could find refuge as activists. But we had to go underground. You had to cross those borders underground, undetected, and try to survive in those other African countries. And so you had a lot of young people, a lot of people that I knew who crossed the borders and ended up in different parts of the world, training militarily and intelligence-wise to support the struggle in South Africa. And a lot of them returned after apartheid ended. But it is the sense that, having grown up with apartheid, that there is a division in terms of how South Africans view the rest of the continent, because it is an imposition, a colonial imposition that forced black people to see themselves as being different to others, period. And so within the South African context, you were always battling the ideology that was imposed upon the idea of blackness. So being African was foreign. What does that mean when you have no power, where you have no sense of identity in some sense, and so growing up in that kind of environment instilled in me the sense of trying to figure out who I was, and instilled in me the determination to try to rewrite that narrative of who we are. Because all around me were people who were doing amazing things, making incredible art, music, poetry. And I felt that needed to be celebrated. But how can you when the structure and the system is against you? What do you do? So you have to come up with some really, interesting ways to make palatable what is there. And so that was my entry into the art world, because I was growing up under censorship, I was growing up under tremendous repression, and art was the only space I felt I could be myself. Only place where I could celebrate with others this sort of amazing creativity that was present in us. And out of that, I guess, grew the passion and the interest to become someone who's interested and is responsible enough to try to rewrite the history of, being black. Mm-hmm. Not only in South Africa, but in the world. Because leaving South Africa and coming to the United States, I realized another reality, that even though from a distance America looks so beautiful and interesting, but there's a whole nother narrative as a black person being in this context. And how do you then readapt and try to deal those systems?
I think what you say is also a good segue in terms of thinking through the structure of the field itself, the fact that it does have an extensive relationship to colonial histories, and at its hallmark, there's this tension with African art in terms of how to categorize it, whether or not it should be the works and the objects and the practices should be in anthropology museums or ethnology museums, or whether or not they should be constituted as fine art and presented to the world as such and decontextualized, so that we can demonstrate that there's an affinity between African art objects and objects that come from Western contexts, particularly like the paintings, the prints, the sculptures, and whatnot. And so one of my questions to you all, now that we're in the 21st century, do you feel, and with the advent of global contemporary art, do you feel that this is something that the field is still battling? This kind of question about where do we place or how do we begin to present and interpret African art?
I don't want to monopolize the stage, but what I will say from my perspective is it's to whose benefit, that these categories are serving. what does it matter? Because if you go to Africa, the same objects, they don't care whether they're artifacts or art objects, but what they care about is what they mean and how they function within the society. You bring them out into the West, they have a totally different meaning, you know, and a history, because now they've been, whether forcibly or through whatever other means, they've ended up in this context. They have a different kind of function. And so for me, it's really to understand what is at stake here. What is operating here? You know, the fact that we can think of them as art objects, what does that mean in terms of their value, their circulation, and their meaning? In terms of how, you know, whether we think of them as cultural objects that belong to a past time, you know, how do they continue to have relevance and currency today? That's where I'm interested in, you know, rather than trying to battle this monstrosity of categorization and moving from one pillar to the other, because that's what always happens. You know, culture gets co-opted. It depending on what the function is and how, you know, the structures that are trying to utilize the objects, they're positioned in various different ways. And so as a knowledge producer, you're able to then make an intervention in terms of how you think the narrative can be rewritten. And that's where I feel I prefer to be situated.
Erika, I'm going to take it back to you because you're very particular in your practice and wanting to speak to people at historically Black colleges and institutions. And so in light of this conversation, I would love it if you could speak a little bit about your perspective and how you approach the field, considering the context where you work and what you're most passionate about.
Well, first, let me start off by saying, you all, I love what I do. I love what I do. I get to found a museum, but the museum is a house for the African art objects that we've had for since as early as 1967, in accordance to my research. Curating or caring for these objects means a lot to me in a few ways. And the way in which I go about curating is, first, I don't look at them like objects. I kind of look at them like cousins or relatives, or they're spirits. Like someone created these objects, whether it was used in a masquerade, whether it was used to commune with the ancestor, whether it was used just so someone could feed their family, right? Someone poured their selves, their essence, their spirit into that, whether it's, again, a replica piece or something that's considered authentic. Someone created it, and to me, they probably created it with love. The objects that were imbued with not only a spirit of an ancestor, a spirit of a deity, or that person's individual spirit, and now I'm getting the opportunity to imbue a little bit of my spirit into it too by caring for them. I love being able to give that back to the community that I serve, which again, Southern University at New Orleans, and to most HBCUs as well, because a lot of us, or people who look like me, for example, I can't trace my ancestry back beyond 1850. I know in New Orleans it's a thing where people can be like, yes, my great-great-grandpappy was such and such. You know, I can't do that. I know that my family were enslaved in that part of Virginia. They were a part of baby farms, which women were forced to mass produce children, and they were sold down to the South. But we don't know anything about who we may have come from, right? I know there was a story in our family, because some of my family members are really short, and they were just like, yeah, they're from the Pygmies in Congo. And, it was just some family lore, but I didn't know what that meant growing up, right? And so coming into this position, I wanted a connection to people that I did not know that survived the brutality of enslavement, making it across a continent. I didn't want the narrative of African Americans, our history began at enslavement. That's not true. Who were the people who created those folks who survived, right? Or even the people who didn't survive. So traditional African art is a medium to me to tell that story. Though a lot of these objects aren't, dated in colonial times. A lot of the things that have come to us are 19th to 20th century. However, they still tell a story to me of strength. They managed to, out of all places they could have been, from whether it's a Cuba textile from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it made it to New Orleans. And one of my students, they get to touch it and feel it and learn about people that they could possibly be related to, right? And so the way that I operate is just allowing the artwork to speak to the students. I take care of them and I help them to speak too, but these objects belong to them. It belongs to you all too, so please come to the museum. But yeah, I just want to be able to give that spirit back to them in the way in which I feel it. And make those connections too, because a lot of people in New Orleans that I've learned may not travel outside of Louisiana. I had opportunities to be able to travel to the continent, and I want to be able to give that back to the people that I serve too, because likely they never will be able to go. So if I can make these connections and introduce them to people such as yourself, that makes it even better. And I think that's also imbuing the objects with that spirit. That was a lot, sorry.
No, that was fine, and in a lot of ways it was very striking, and it's nice for me to hear how you talk about it because I'm a little bit older than you, and as a result, I remember when it was actually a political thing for people to align themselves with Africa and African things, when it was no longer a negative thing, and when there was a conscientious effort among African Americans in the late 60s and 70s to make that so that you could speak about being the steward of a collection that comes from that time period. That was a very thoughtfully created collection by people who were trying to reshape and restructure the narrative about Africa in the context of the United States. My parents, particularly in their generation and in the community I came from, were very pointed in talking about the ways that when they grew up in the 40s and 50s, people used to say that Africa was a place with no history, that it had nothing that anybody wanted to look to for innovation, that they had made no contributions. And so they were really thoughtful about pointing to civilizations in Africa so that they could counter that. So when you talk about the Egyptology, of course, that and the obsession with Egypt, that's definitely was there. But I also recall the fascination with Ghana and other areas like that. And the fascination, of course, with South Africa because of the histories in the southern United States. And sometimes the ways we still would conflate and, how we romanticize things African as an extreme to kind of counter all of the negative discourses that existed before. So it's really nice to hear how you talk about it. And for me, I would like for you, Amanda, to talk about your role as the curator of the collection at NOMA, and not only because you mentioned that you didn't have exposure to this field early on, but some of the ways you navigate these kind of complex terrains and discourses about Africanness, about Blackness, and all of these things with your work, and also the ways in which the objects are categorized. I'm glad we've come a long way from talking about primitive art versus whatever, but it would be really wonderful for you to talk about your practice and how you approach, how you negotiate these things.
Sure, yeah, and I think I'm sort of pivoting on some of the things that especially Tumelo and Erika have said, where there's a presence to the art, and that's something that got me started back in 2001 pretty early, where I was working a site that was older than I could comprehend, and yet again, that there's a gap in education, there's a gap in narratives and knowledge, and that's intentional. And I think that's what I was starting to learn through the 20 years that I've been working with African art and studying. You have to go out there and really put the effort in to learn about it as an American in this country. And that's why I've dedicated my life to it. And then through all that, you realize that museums very much give us a particular narrative, which we then call a canon. And that is a very American way of thinking about art, African people, African narratives. So again, I want to remind everyone that there is a particular narrative, as Tumelo mentioned, that is being pushed forward, and who is it serving? And I think that's where a lot of my work comes in, as I look at that and realize that the canon of African art, especially in museums, is very colonial. Who is that in service to? And what does that tell us? That art only stopped and began during a colonial period when Europeans were coming to the continent? No. As Erika said, that it goes back. I mean, the civilizations there, the ancient histories, the ancient art that has affected the rest of the world is really significant. I think Wangechi Mutu even talks about the first art and the first stories have been told from Africa. That's what we need to remember, not that it started in the 19th century when Africans and their art were forcibly removed. So that is very important to me when looking at a collection at New Orleans Museum of Art. It is very canonical from a Western narrative. It's very much during the colonial period. It kind of stops in its tracks at the 1930s. What does that tell us about African art? And so I'm really engaged with broadening that narrative and bringing in other voices. Curation should never be a single story. It should never be a single voice. So I very much go out and try to bring some of those stories to the community, but also bring the community in to tell me what they know about it. Because there is a presence, there is a different experience, a different perspective from all of us, and I think that's really important in reinventing and re-looking at those narratives and those histories. And again, that forcible kind of removal, that was an intentional removal, just like sort of ethnicizing people on the continent was also a colonial way of dividing people and making them easier to control and then to remove objects and art from them. There's more I could say as well about that sort of invention of African art as a canon. You know, it's only been shown as art in the West since maybe the 1910s, 20s. It became a field in around the 1950s, 60s, especially with Peace Corps people going from the West to Africa, and then started being taught in universities around that time. So it's a pretty young field, and so there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of folks, you know, coming on board. And I just hope to see this field grow more and more to add more of that absence of knowledge that we really have in this field because it's so young.
Thank you. I want to do something maybe a little bit unusual since we're in a smaller room. We have 18 minutes left, and I would like it if people in the audience have questions to give you the opportunity to ask the panelists, because I think it's really important that you also get some of your questions answered, or we can speak to some of those issues. So if you feel inclined to ask a question, please do. We have a microphone for you.
Raise your hand.
This one.
Oh, over here.
Thank you.
You stay where you are. I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Just think of me as Phil Donahue.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. So I have a question specifically for Erika, but all of you are welcome to answer as well, just with your interest in Egyptology. So I've, like, a lot of what I've learned about art history, and I study art history, is like that Egypt is often considered to be a part of Western civilization and Western history in a way that other African art isn't. Like, you know, it's part of like the Louvre's like main collections, that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about just kind of bringing that back and reconnecting it towards other parts of African art, and maybe how you think that narrative has arisen and how maybe, I don't know, you or others are working to change that. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. A few thoughts about that. So, yes, ancient Egypt has been taken out of its African context, and I understand why people have tried to do it, but you can never remove it from the continent of Africa, right? I understand that because of the Sinai, it's touching Asia. Because of the trades and things that were happening between Greece and Italy and all of these other places, especially when you go to northern Egypt, which is technically southern Egypt because the Nile flows from south to north, that you see more people who may be of fairer skin, or for the fact that Egypt over time has been colonized many times by many different people. Or people groups or nations. However, it still has remained on the continent. You can't like saw it off and like throw it somewhere else, right? And because of issues with colonialism and Eurocentric ideas to say, oh, Black people or people of sub-Saharan descent, they couldn't have made these giant structures. No, aliens did it, or someone else did. Or I remember hearing something about there's this structure in Zimbabwe called the Great Zimbabwe, this beautiful stone structure, and they were just like, no way, Africans didn't do that. It had been some lost Euro group down there, and
Wild.
so many theories, and they pushed it, right? Because again, coming with this idea of we're here, you all haven't been able to create guns or have these things that we have in Europe, so that means that you couldn't have done it, right? But that's not true. And the ways in which we think about race construct, especially here in the US, to the ancient Egyptians, if you were Egyptian, you were Egyptian, that's it. Like there wasn't anything else. It was just they were Egyptian. It wasn't a darker Egyptian or a lighter Egyptian. It was that, right? But I digress. Getting into the field with this too, and I think about the Nile, how it flows. The Nile starts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and flows up, right? So just think about how the waters of the Nile feeds and allows things to grow as the longest river in the world, just flowing upwards, right? All of these different countries, all of these different people groups, they share that. So why can't we talk about Egypt within an African context? Why can't we talk about, oh, did you know that there were masking traditions in ancient Egypt too? Like there are masking traditions currently in West Africa or South Africa or Central Africa, et cetera. Or if you look at Egyptian headrests, you'll see the same things in Ethiopia, right? But to some, if you start to highlight those things, it'll begin to break down a narrative that, a lot of these people, they are the same. A lot of those ideas are the same. These people, they have connections with sub-Saharan Africa, and I hate saying that because Africa is Africa to me, but, because we live in the time that we live in and people, I get passionate. They break it apart in different ways. I have to say it as a academic in a sense, but they try to find ways to separate that, to show like who's more powerful or et cetera. I don't agree with that, so I don't teach it in that way. I always come from a point of wanting to respect the ancients for who they were. And if I can go into a temple and see a depiction that shares my same skin tone, I'm going to make that relationship. Anyone can make a relationship to art or to history. History belongs to all of us, whether some people say that it doesn't, right? If people can go in from Hollywood and create depictions and make people align to their standards, why can I do the same, or why can I have that relationship too, right? So, sorry, that was also a lot. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Hopefully it did. Anybody else want to touch on that?
I'll add a little bit more to that. I think the other thing to think about in the context of Egypt, that it is still considered to be also the Arab Republic of Egypt, and it is an Islamic context. So while, as Tumelo kind of alluded to, Africa is a very complex continent with a diverse groups of people within as well as across borders, and also various religions.
Yes.
And so this kind of overlay and the politics that are surround like this issue of how do you categorize Egyptians also would have to evolve in the scholarship in terms of how do they want to define themselves as well beyond like some of the impositions and the ways we might want them categorized outside of the country. And so that would be another factor to look at. I would be happy to talk to you after the session to elaborate on that more, but you can never lose sight of that fact of the connection to Islam, but also in the kind of the northern part of the country to the Mediterranean and the kind of the cross-cultural connections that come from that as well.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Hi there. Thank you guys so much for being here. My question's for Tumelo. My name's Mikhail. I'm a graduate student here. I'm also from Johannesburg. My family's from El Dorado Park. And as you can probably tell by my accent, I grew up in Texas. And so, yeah, that one throws people off. But my question for you, Tumelo, is, we moved to San Antonio when I was about 4 years old from Joburg. And most of my family is still there. But as soon as we moved, we stopped speaking Afrikaans at home, and we kind of I lost a lot of, I guess, attachment. We'd visit every couple of years. But unlike a lot of my other friends, I had a lot of friends growing up who were also from immigrant diasporas, and they kind of had people that they could go to and speak their language and find community with. And I think for me, it's as some of you guys are finding out, a lot of people left South Africa to get away from people like me, right? So there's a lot of people in the United States who are South African, and it's always very strange sometimes when I meet other South Africans, right? I have to gauge out okay, what's your racial ideology? There's all this work that you kind of have to put into it before you can figure out your community. So I guess my question for you is, how do you kind of stay connected with South African culture, and how do you kind of balance, being South African but also living in the United States? Do you have any advice for me or any tips? I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a long conversation to have, but I will say that I think the most important thing for me, at least, is feeling connected to my family at home. I think that keeps me rooted here. It gives me a sense of place, and it also allows me to feel I have a bigger community, that, being here is not my only world, that I have other world beyond what I do and where I live here in the United States. So, and I think what the bigger picture is really understanding that being South African doesn't limit you. It actually makes you understand the world is much broader. And so you have to figure out how you navigate between those different borders. And that's why, for me, I work not only within the African context, but I work within the Caribbean context, because I feel an affinity with the experience of the Caribbean, living here. So that's a short answer to your question.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. I want to ask a question about the topic of repatriation. I've read that something like 90+% of African cultural objects are no longer on the continent. So specifically as they relate to your work or our activism, what are your thoughts? What are your strategies on potentially no longer stewarding these objects? Thank you.
She looks to me.
Right.
So I actually have been working with this subject for a number of years now, and going back to the last ACASA triennial, began a group of folks that formed and wrote best practices and guidelines for North American museums holding these objects, cultural objects from Africa, and trying to sort out some of those histories, give case studies, look to some of the European models, and compile something for America, because we do have our own museum complex, and make those recommendations, particularly because a lot of museums that house these objects don't necessarily have a specialist. They don't know what they're looking at. They don't know who to talk to. So we are trying to make collaborative efforts and introduce the folks that one might get in touch with to help you identify what you have, to find the communities you should speak with, to find ways to collaborate rather than just a one-way giving it all back. I think it needs to be a much more dynamic, long-term, sustainable relationship. And that's the point of view I come through through several years of conversations with international scholars, community members, and so on and so forth. I think there's also gradations of the works, and it's so complex that it's really difficult to get into a long conversation about it right now, but there are certain ones that are absolutely, we know they were stolen. And we can point to that particular time and place, 1897,
Yes.
raid on Benin City, most famous case right now, but there's, of course, Ghana. There's many, many, many other cases. And I think if you focus too much on the one, you forget about all those other things that were happening during that period that were very intentional, very much taking those things to put forward an idea and a narrative of civilization from a very Eurocentric standpoint. So they do need to go back. A lot of them do. At the same time, I think that they could be a really strong case for forming those relationships. And one could also make the case, and it has been made, that museums are on the continent. There are many, many museums on the continent. I think Americans don't necessarily recognize that. And so we should be forming collaborative efforts, curating shows together, loaning objects from everywhere else in the world as well. It doesn't just have to be African art shown in Africa. So I think it just needs to pry open a bit more and have a much more collaborative vision. It's a long-term strategy. And there are a lot of cases of returns right now. There need to be more. I am definitely on board for that. But you also have to speak with those communities that might have ownership, or intangible or otherwise, the heritage, and see what they want to do. I think that's important too. So museums making that case, we're just going to give it back. I don't want to say this and get myself in trouble. It's a little lazy. Do more. Make relationships. And I think that will move us better into the future. Does that make sense? That's my thoughts on the matter.
Can I add a piece to that? So in one of my classes, we talk about ethical cases within the museum world. And I found this article that was fascinating coming from a group of African Americans who are against having the Benin bronzes that are here in America go back to Benin or to Nigeria.
It's a legal case.
Yet they made it a legal case? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, they made it a legal case. And that's to say, if you send those objects back, how do we still engage with them, right? As people who've been taken from whether it's Nigeria or Senegal or Ghana, et cetera, how do they still have a stake in that? What if their ancestors were also from Nigeria during that time period, however brought to the United States? How do they still have a stake in that history and heritage too? So it also comes up in a conversation of who does history belong to? Who are the rightful owners? I hate that term too. But there are all these different conversations that are happening in all of these various communities. And I 100% agree with Amanda. We need to start opening up and having these conversations about it, right? Can we not talk to people or the Oba who's in Benin, or speak to people within the museum, speak to the communities in New Orleans or New York or Johannesburg or et cetera, just to have this conversation about how do we still learn from our collective history, right? But again, punitive expedition of 1897, the looting and razing of the Kingdom of Benin was terrible, and objects should very much go back.
Yeah.
But I'm just presenting a case that there are others who are bringing scenarios as to why they shouldn't.
I think if I want to add a little more,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
There are certain things like the Royal Treasury from Benin City or that of Ghana, and I think it's really important that a national treasure or a sort of heritage treasures like that go back, because it'd be like taking our Statue of Liberty and like plopping it somewhere else. It's like, this is our identity. So there's certain things that is clear cut, but then there's times like the trafficking of art happened very much during the Biafran Civil War. So there are things that you can't very clearly define that moment, but there's a little bit of certain shrine figures were looted during that time. Should they belong here? Probably not.
Tumelo, would you like to say anything? We have a few minutes, and
I'll
we
try to
also
be
have someone in
brief
the audience.
because I
Yeah.
think this question of repatriation seems to be more relevant today, but it's been a question on the table for the longest time.
Yes.
It's not a new question.
100%.
So my question is, why is it a burning issue today when it's been on the table for this long? And what are we doing about it?
And denied time and again.
Yeah.
People were refusing those conversations and for their own benefit. And now I'm happy that things are moving forward where we are having the conversations where we're saying, let's take a step back. But that perspective was wrong, Eurocentric, et cetera. Let's bring everyone to the table to talk about it, right? So I think conversations like this definitely help to bring that forward more.
And we have one last question.
Hello, my name is Marnie Garcia Mamertz. I work for Contemporary End. I actually have a question for you, Tumelo. I was wondering, as someone who is African, coming to the United States, and I guess kind of recognizing also the power that U.S. American discourse holds, like within the contemporary art world, but also as someone who has this really interesting profile of having a practice that engages also in the Caribbean. how has that process been like kind of arriving here with this non-US American perspective? Because as someone, I'm German-Cuban, and who's currently considering actually like moving to the US, that's something that I really kind of struggle with, kind of this appreciation of the force and of the strength, and I draw so much from US American Black knowledge and the discourse that has been created, and at the same time I see that sometimes there's limitations in the ways that other Black, non-US American perspectives are being engaged with, especially in a contemporary art context. I don't know if that question makes sense. But it can also be a conversation for afterwards because it's very long.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't have a 1 minute response to that, except to say that I think it's true that you have to understand the context in which you work in. And so I think the knowledge of what you bring is what really sort of helps you address the issues that you might be concerned with. So coming from South Africa and living in the United States, thinking about race issues for me was something more natural because I grew up in a very divided society. So how I began to address those was different because I had to understand what the American system would allow me to do, and then figure out what's the best way to bring my knowledge and conversation to the table. So it's really more about building experience in where you want to be and work, and how you then begin to actually articulate your narrative.
I want to thank our panel for being here today. And